Welcome to episode 311 of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. I am your host, Morgan, aka Baun Diesel, and this week we'll be talking about a big Xbox marketing change and a bunch of other info, EA's CEO possibly getting a new job, insane comments on my videos, and much more. Before we get started, subscribe to the Baunfire Gaming Podcast on your favorite podcast app and leave a review on Spotify or iTunes, or subscribe to the Baun Diesel YouTube channel to get all of my videos, including this podcast. Thank you to everyone who supports as YouTube members and Twitch subscribers. If you're interested in supporting this podcast and all of my other content, check out the link in the show description. Let's get into some gaming news and our main story this week. A new Xbox marketing push and Phil Spencer interviews. So what this all kicked off with was, I think some of these interviews must have dropped before they were supposed to, or at least before the marketing push happened. And so, predictably, at least in my opinion, we start seeing these stories from the expected influencers and journalists and stuff like that of, oh, Phil Spencer says there's no red line on what franchises could be multi-platform. And we start this cycle all over again, like we do about once a month, it seems like, where suddenly every single journalist is the most jilted Xbox fan ever, and now has to go on a crusade against their offender, and now they must let everyone know that Xbox is doomed. And then a bunch of other stuff came out. So the order I got all of this in was seeing stories about the red line, which, one, just because they can put things on other platforms doesn't mean they're going to. And two, they've been saying this now for a year, if not more. They may have been passively saying it for much longer. Yeah, like we know of this, whatever the directive is at Microsoft, at like the executive level, that they have a thing going right now where they're considering every option. They're considering every game to go multi-platform. And then sometimes that consideration is going to lead to that. And then sometimes it won't. And we've already seen examples of that. The way you've seen like the Indiana Jones game that is going to PlayStation after a short exclusive period on Xbox. The way we're going to see Doom be day and day on PlayStation, where they haven't said, well, you know, we think our Xbox platform is failing and, well, we just have to put it on other platforms now. There's always been explanations of like, oh yeah, so-and-so when they were making this game was saying that they really wanted it to be like Doom was one of these examples where the other Doom games are on all the platforms, and the studio head, I believe, was like, hey, we'd really like to keep doing that with this game, with this series. And Xbox was like, cool, go nuts. Like it's not as nefarious or as conspiratorial as I think it gets pushed sometimes. There's also the whole thing that this is what corporations do. I'm sure there's been a meeting at Sony where they've looked around and said, hey, should we put Helldivers 2 on Xbox? And at least so far, they've decided not to do that. But if you don't think they've at least considered it, you just don't understand how these corporations work. So every time you see an article or every time you see a story about Microsoft considering doing this thing, yeah, probably, but they're almost certainly not going to do it. All the things that we see these big corporations do, that when they actually take action on things, that is the one time that's the one idea out of probably 500 that they actually implemented from various people on various teams and things like that. So it's fine, whatever. These articles start coming out, then we see the branding come out. So there's a new marketing push being done by Xbox, and it's this is not an Xbox branding. So I think it's really clever. I think it's funny. where in various ways they've been showing like a picture of a phone and being like, this is an Xbox, or a picture of a the ROG Ally, the handheld PC. This is an Xbox. And then showing like a toaster and being like, this is not an Xbox. And they're, at least in my opinion, in a lighthearted way, pointing out that like if it has a screen, you can probably play Xbox games on it. And that's such a cool message. It was so frustrating to see, but not surprising, to see people like Jez Corden, to see people like Paul Tassi doing like the hand and face emotes and stuff like that. It's like, guys, come on, like, it doesn't frustrate me that much when like normies, even people like myself, get all hot and bothered about this stuff and throw out like bad takes about it, or throw out like reactionary or like short thinking takes on this kind of stuff, because including myself, we don't really know how this stuff works. It's not our job to know, right? I take a lot of pride and I try to educate myself and to think deeper about a lot of these things, but I still won't pretend like I'm an expert, right? But these people are. It's their job. Like, it's their job to understand these things and to talk about them and explain them and give, the positive and negative perspectives, and explain why maybe Microsoft is doing this and why it may work or why it might not. But instead, there's always this just like this hyper pessimism about anything. And why it's so frustrating to me, and we'll get more into it, it's these guys know better. Like they at least Jez, I don't know about Paul. Well, I don't know if he talks to anyone who actually knows anything, but like, and it's not just them, it's a bunch of other people too. Like they know what's going on. Like they certainly, of all the people, and maybe I'm wrong, they should understand what's happening. Like why Xbox is doing this stuff. They've been trying, or they tried to play the PlayStation game, to put out a console and sell games that are only on that, and then have third-party games too, and let's see who wins. And for the most part, Sony's always won. Even if you think back to 360 and PS3 days, 360 had a big time advantage. It came out earlier, and for much of that generation outsold the PS3. But by the end, it didn't. By the end of that generation, the PS3 outsold it. And so there's this like weird obsession, it seems, with a lot of influencers, especially grifty kind of clickbaity people, but even journalists, of like, if Xbox doesn't just try to copy Sony's formula, they're giving up. While also constantly reporting on how Xbox is in third place. And that's a whole different conversation about how, if you ever see someone say like, Xbox is in third place, blah, 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 remind yourself that that metric is purely off console sales. From the ABK leak documents we got a couple years ago, I think a couple years ago now, showing like revenue and profit margin and stuff. It's very likely, and I think especially after what happened with Concord and stuff like that, I believe it was in the 2021 part of that, most of that fiscal year, is what this financial record showed that got leaked. And it showed that while PlayStation had almost twice as much revenue as Xbox actually took home more money. They had a higher profit margin, a much higher profit margin, but they also took home more money. So I'm making these figures up off the top of my head, but say PlayStation made, $2 billion and Xbox made $1 billion. Of the $2 billion, Sony only took home, like $500 million. But of the 1 million, Xbox took home like $750 million. Again, not accurate numbers, but just to throw it out, just to say it, it's, if we were doing more all around takes on this stuff, that probably wouldn't be the way we'd portray it. One thing to point out too, from what I remember about that document, both the profits, if you combine the profits during the period that was shown of Xbox and PlayStation together, Nintendo still made more, and I think it was almost twice as much. It's just crazy. But anyways, getting back to it, you saw the usual suspects like freaking out about this. And I just don't get it. I really don't understand. If you don't like what they're doing with going towards this multi-platform, or even just saying like everything's an Xbox, and they're not even talking about PlayStation at that point. There's obviously not a PlayStation in this marketing, but there's an Xbox Series X and an Xbox Series S, and there's a tablet and a laptop and a desktop and a phone, and and some of the handheld devices, and even I think a VR headset. Like, I just don't understand the controversy about this, especially this, where it's not even talking about PlayStation. I think the big thing for me is that it seems like there's so much obsession with this, and how it's like, well, like I see this as a play by them to get people in, because so many people play games on their phone now. Like, way more people play games on their phone than anything else. So is the strategy not, and maybe I'm wrong, but I've always seen the strategy as, if someone has a tablet, a Chromebook, a non-gaming laptop, a phone, and we give them the option to get 2 free months of Game Pass, and it's accessible on their device, and they check it out and they find a game or two they like, and they're like, oh dang, this thing's actually really cool. This is worth 10, 15 bucks a month or whatever. But man, I feel like there's a better way to play this. And that is a play to get people to get, either an Xbox or to get a PC. And it's not going to convert everyone. It's going to convert probably a fairly small number of people. But, a lot of those people instead will just keep using Game Pass on the device they have. Or they'll get an Xbox and you'll get that revenue, and you'll get that much higher profit margin when they buy things directly through the Xbox. Or they'll get a PC and get PC Game Pass and, do all of that stuff instead. I think it's strange that there's so much, and so much of the conversation I've seen has been people just being like, as someone who's like an OG Xbox guy or girl, seeing them get away from a focus on consoles is just really, it's losing its soul or whatever. Like, what are you talking about? Like it's, there's been so much conversation I've seen about people being like, their new identity is being on every device and stuff like that. And I guess I just, like, from an outside perspective, like, I try to look at the situation as someone who has no loyalties, no biases, and or no preferences or whatever. And I just feel like if you look at it from a very base angle of, and this isn't to dog PlayStation, obviously they're doing very well on their own, but if you look at one platform that's like obsessed with keeping you in their walled garden to like the extreme, and you look at another platform that's like, play where, oh, we don't care, just play our stuff, and we're going to give you lots of options. We have some our own options, like the consoles that we sell, or on your PC or on that tablet over there, whatever. We just want you in our ecosystem, playing our games, and other people's games through our system, right? I just find it so hard to believe that a neutral person would look at this and be like, "Whoa, Xbox is really messing up by giving people choice." Like, I can't comprehend it. And there's so much conversation, and I see it all the time. People, I think, are starting to acknowledge that a little bit more, but then you'll see it turn to another negative thing. It'll be, oh, well, I just don't see them making any more consoles, which we'll talk about what Phil actually said about that. But like, there seems to be this obsession, and it's the same as that kind of, I really do believe that Nintendo, to a point, but especially PlayStation, is really stuck in a 15 or 20-year-old idea of the market, of being like, we need to get them on our console, and we're going to do that by putting really, really good games, like, no doubt, exclusively on this console, where you have to buy it. Even though we won't make much money on that console, we will make a lot of money off the software people buy on it or for it. And that's all that matters, which means that all we care about is selling hardware. The more hardware, the more software we sell, and we're peachy queen. And they are, and that's a strategy that's still working today. But with the rise of streaming, with the rise of digital sales, with the rise of people, being interested in other platforms and things like that, I still think that there's an argument to be made that maybe it's not the best long-term way to look at it. And even today, I don't think you can really look. It's why I was saying before, I don't think you can look and compare the platforms by hardware units sold and use that as your sole measurement for how good or bad the different platforms are. Like I really, I think it's borderline irresponsible, but you see so many people stuck on that. You see so many people, whether they're journalists or gamers or influencers or whatever, just really stuck in that like siloed view of what is successful or not. And it's almost entirely based off of unit sales, which is weird. Like it just doesn't work anymore. So I don't know. I think it's very interesting. Um, I just, I don't get how, and even if you don't agree with the strategy, um, it surprises me that so few people will even acknowledge the strategy that Xbox is going for. You can still say like, "Oh, I don't think this is gonna work. Like, this doesn't seem to, I don't think this is gonna work," but I understand what they're trying to do. There's so little of even that. It's you literally will see people be like, "Oh yeah, Xbox is checked out. Microsoft is getting ready to sell them and all this stuff." It's like I don't think that's the case. Like that I think that you're, you know, again, just so stuck on this like very specific idea on how these platforms can be successful without recognizing that, as far as we know at this point, Xbox is doing pretty well. Even Phil said it in some of these interviews. Like, yeah, we're healthier than we were. And when you look at the sales they're making, and when you're looking at the stuff they're doing, when you look at Game Pass subs and stuff like that, they're probably doing pretty well. I believe it was sometime this year or last year that Xbox became Microsoft's biggest profiting department, or at least in revenue. I don't know about profit. So I don't know. It's just the campaign. I think is a good idea. I think it's fun. It's kind of funny. You'll see that I co-opted it for the title and the thumbnails for this show. I just I don't get it. I don't get why people are. I mean, I do. I know exactly why people are reacting the way they are. At least some people. I just wish they wouldn't. But we'll see. Speaking of some of the future stuff, Phil did directly confirm that they're working on a handheld device, a handheld Xbox, but seemed to imply that it's not coming like anytime soon. And I don't know if it's so hard. Like, the average consumers, take on what far away means is different than what like a developer. Like, to me, Phil is probably thinking, in increments of 3 months, right? So, if he says that something's far away, that probably means it's more than 6 or 12 months out. It may not mean it's 5 years away. I suspect it's not. I assume someone in his position has to really regulate how they look at the future, in that, they're probably working on stuff that's 10 years away. And then they're working on another tier of stuff that's like 5 years away. And another tier of stuff that's 3 years or 2 years or 1 year or 6 months away. And I wonder sometimes if their concept of time, or at least relating that to us, is sometimes affected. So we'll have to see what that means. I imagine we'll get some teases on that in the next year or two for the handheld. It does seem to suggest, at least in my opinion, that there is not like a planned dual release, which that was what I was assuming would happen. It would be like in 2026 or 27, they would reveal the new Xbox and the handheld at the same time. But someone replied to me, I forget who it was, and they made a good point of like, hey, like they probably won't try to cannibalize themselves again. What they'll probably do is release a new system first, and then within a year or two, release the handheld as like a companion system. And that makes sense, or a standalone system if that's how you choose to use it. So yeah, I mean that made sense to me, but the chatter about the handheld was definitely interesting. He very clearly, I believe it was I can't remember if it was The Verge or Wall Street Journal. There was one of the articles they directly asked him. They're like, hey, you know, all these moves you're making is making people worry that you aren't going to make more hardware in the future. And he straight up very clearly said, like, no, there's going to be more Xboxes. Like, we're going to put out more Xboxes and other hardware, which I don't really know what that means. You know, maybe that was a reference to the handheld. Maybe it's other stuff. I have no idea. But the thing is that the way that the coverage happens with this stuff, though, is no matter what he says, no matter what Xbox says or messages or shows, that there's so many people who are so dependent, especially content creators, who are so dependent on this panic and this stress and this drama that no matter what they do or say, there's still going to be a narrative getting pushed to too many people that, oh, Xbox is failing. They're getting out of the console game. They're going full multi-platform. They're going to be a third-party studio. And they have no reason to change that messaging. And they're going to keep doing it. I saw pushback on it when I was talking about some of this stuff on different social media platforms of being like, hey, look, he literally just said very clearly there's more Xboxes coming. And someone pushing back and be like, well, you can't believe anything he says. Xbox changes their mind on everything, you know, nowadays, which like is probably objectively false. I'm sure that you can come up with some weird examples, and you know, you talk about things like Tango Gameworks and, you know, studios they've shut down and stuff. And you're like, well, they said they were going to make more games and now they're gone. Like, you know, you can find examples that work technically, which is the best kind of working. But I just, you know, no matter what they say or do, there's a subset of people, I would say a vocal minority, who are going to find a way to twist it into a negative. And it's really weird. And it's especially weird to me, and I've talked about this before, because like, I don't know what these people want. Like, I don't know if they want Xbox to fail, because that's only going to be bad for them. If Xbox leaves the market, PlayStation becomes even more anti-consumer, even more expensive, probably makes even fewer games than they're currently doing. Like, it's only bad if Xbox leaves the market, but I digress. It was interesting that there was also some statements about mid-gen refreshes, and I don't think it was technically a shot at PlayStation, but Phil basically said like, hey, like, doing a mid-gen refresh needs to make sense for our studios, for the developers, as well as the third parties, and not just to benefit ourselves. And I think what he meant there is to sell more consoles. So it probably was a little bit of a shot at Sony. And even though it seems like a lot of people are happy with what the PS5 Pro does, it still does kind of seem like it's kind of a vanity thing. Like, you know, they just did it because they could, right? And that maybe it, you know, it's not really, you know, I don't know. I have no idea, but it was interesting hearing him say that, because if you remember in the last generation, the Xbox One did get a One X, and it was I had one. It's one of my favorite consoles I've ever had. It was, I had a Scorpio edition too, which was the code name for it. And some of the early pre-orders had the branding on it. It was really cool. And that console was great, and it needed it. The Xbox One was a bad console. So was the PS4. They were using like laptop grade CPU, GPU tech, and it was bad. They were underpowered, even for the games that were coming out in like the early mid generation. And you know, the One X and the PS4 Pro weren't that much better, but they sure felt better. And with the, you know, Xbox Series X and S, especially the X, that need doesn't seem really as much there. Obviously, there's more and more games coming that have maybe kind of shoddy, you know, performance modes and really not that impressive quality modes as well, but they're still there and they're able to do it. Where the PS5 Pro, like, it still has some modes, like it still has under 60 FPS modes on various games, because those games are just too demanding, even for a slightly upgraded hardware. So the mid-gen refresh conversation was interesting. I still think that they're going to try, you know, to release a new console in like 26 or 27, very likely a year or two before the PS6 comes out. And I think they're going to try to jump on it again. And really, more than anything, I'm like super cool with them not trying to do this rat race anymore. Like, obviously Switch, obviously Nintendo bounced after the GameCube. We you know, with the Wii, they definitely weren't trying to compete with the PS, you know, 3 or the PS4, you know, the similar consoles on Xbox. And then especially with the Wii U and especially with the Switch, which is literally using mobile hardware, and I believe the next one is expected to as well, like not laptop, but like tablet, tech. Um, it's really just kind of come down to, you know, PlayStation and Xbox, and this last gen they released fairly close to each other. I could very well see Xbox trying to release, 2+ years ahead of the PlayStation 6, and I bet PlayStation would probably be okay with it. They probably don't really care at this point. They know that, they have 100+ million users that like their stuff. If they put out a new console, they're probably going to sell at least 50 to 75 million of them. And that the games they put out, people are probably going to love them, and they'll probably sell well, as long as it's not a hero shooter, free, not actually free to play game. I would just be okay if they got out of the cycle of trying to compete directly. And it's very likely that we'll start getting, new consoles or new hardware from these places every 3 or 4 years in a somewhat staggered fashion. So we'll have to wait and see. It was interesting that Phil said in these interviews that he's still looking to acquire studios. It seems like they have an especially close eye on non-American or non-North American studios. I'll be really curious if after Stalker 2 releases, I wouldn't be surprised at all if that studio ends up getting bought by Xbox, even if they, keep their games multi-platform. If you consider how long it's been since the last Stalker game, they may not release a PlayStation or any exclusive game anytime soon. They take their time, as we've seen. The whole war thing probably doesn't help either. We had the red line comments. I still just don't think that's what they've said, and we're seeing a handful of examples of that coming true. I stand with some other people I've seen, I think like Paris Lily and some others saying like, hey, I definitely don't want to see Halo or Gears on PlayStation, but it might happen. You'll have to wait and see. It's not really up to us. And kind of doing one more swing around, I just don't, I think people's obsession with this, say Xbox went full third party, quote unquote, say they did start selling all their games on every platform, but they still release an Xbox because that's the best profit margin for them, is for people to buy their games on their own hardware, right? They still have Game Pass. They are still putting out, exclusive games. I just, that's, none of those things are a bad thing. I don't get it. I don't get, how it's being portrayed as a bad thing. And I see the conversation go a lot of like, well, it's not like PlayStation's going to give any of their games to Xbox. Yeah, probably not. They're the industry leader. Why would they hold out an olive branch? They don't need to do that. They also struggle to get their own games out on PC in any timely fashion, and often not in very good shape. And that's very purposeful, at least in my opinion. It seems like PlayStation struggles with doing good PC ports. I know that they've been improving that in more recent years, but it still seems to be at least somewhat of an issue. And two, they seem to really, like I was saying before, they could release their games day and day on PC and PlayStation, but that would cost them PlayStation unit sales. And I think that's the very obvious reason why they don't do it, and why they have no desire to. I'm sure there's development reasons. I'm sure there's more to it, but it definitely seems like the chief reason. Finally, there was a bit about Avowed where he basically said that, like, hey, we didn't delay that because there's anything wrong with it. We literally just needed to spread our games out, because right now they have games come out, like Killzone 2's coming out soon. The Flight Simulator's coming out soon. We have Indiana Jones coming out soon, and they just didn't want to stumble over each other. I also suspect that under the, behind closed doors, they were probably also trying to avoid Dragon Age. They're such different games in probably most ways, but they definitely have, I guess, enough similarities that they probably wanted some of that conversation to die down before they jumped in. I do have to point out that there was some, I think, just like really gross conversations around these articles. Obviously, you're going to have all the clickbaiters and rage baiters and, engagement people like doing all the stuff about the red line and all that. But there was one person, and I can't remember their name, and I think they blocked me at this point, or I blocked them, I can't remember, um, who took a picture from one of these articles of Phil and was like, oh, I was going to make fun of him for the toll that being a CEO takes on you, but man, he looks really unhealthy. I hope he's not sick, or like, I hope he's doing all right. And it's like, what are you talking about? He looks like he's lost weight and he's getting older. He's probably on that Ozempic or something. He's probably cutting a bunch of pounds with a little bit of help. And so, yeah, he looks different than he did 20 years ago, but so do most of us. You should have seen me 20 years ago. I was looking pretty good for a teenager, I guess. I guess everyone, for the most part, looks better when they're younger. But I just, it was so frustrating and it was so gross. It was so weird too, just like doing the online doctor thing, especially when like there was definitely like passive aggressive intent or behind it. The way it was worded, it was so gross. Um, and then what really blew my mind was a fairly well-known journalist who literally recently in the last couple years had their own cancer fight and beat it and are healthy now, or doing well at least, played into it and was like, oh yeah, I know the toll that, being sick can take on your body, and he doesn't look good, does he? It's like, what are you doing? Like, you're literally like a really well-known journalist, and you're like kind of corroborating or at least like piling on to this really weird, super weird take of a guy. And if you see other pictures that were taken during these interviews, he just looks like Phil. Like, again, he looks older and it looks like he's lost some weight, and it was probably because he's, doesn't want to be, a thick boy anymore. And I can appreciate that. So it's just like, I really hated it, man. It was so gross. It was such a good example of how far this stuff has devolved. The conversations and the discourse around any of this stuff is just the tribalism, all that crap. And that carried on with a bunch of the articles. Like, you could tell that there were a bunch of people who legitimately just read headlines and went nuts. They didn't read the content of any of the interviews. Jeremy Pinter, I think is his name, or ACG, is I think one of the most objective reviewers out there. Even if I don't always agree with all of his takes, and even he posts, he's like, I read all of these Phil Spencer interviews, and now I'm seeing all these people putting out tweets and videos about it, and it's like none of them read, like none of them even know what he said or what the answers were or the context or the questions. It's just like, it's all just whoever gets the quickest, hottest take, even if the information is literally like false and not true. So overall, I like the strategy they're going for. I think it's probably smart for them. Something I've been saying over and over again is just, I think my biggest frustration is that we see this platform who we, deem is in third place, and in many metrics it probably is amongst Nintendo and PlayStation, doing something different, trying something else. And it's so strange to me how, whether it's gamers or journalists or whoever, we've watched, or we did watch Xbox fail for years and years and years to just try to replicate PlayStation's strategy of, have a good console, have, a handful of good, sad dad over the shoulder, third person action adventure games, and just, try to sell as many consoles as you can. And I think as soon as they started doing Game Pass stuff, that became less relevant. And I just feel like there's so many people who are so stuck on just like a very simple way of looking at how these things are doing or not. So we'll see. Some other stories I can hit on real quick. EA's CEO, Andrew Wilson, is being considered to take the same role at Disney to replace Bob Iger. If you don't know what's happened over at Disney, Bob Iger was the head of Disney for many years, CEO or whatever his title was, left, I believe, thought they were leaving it in good hands. It didn't go well. Bob Iger came back, has been the CEO again, I think, for a couple of years. And now they're thinking about moving on again. He probably wants to actually retire this time. And Andrew Wilson, who, if you're a gamer, you probably know who he is. may or may not be a good pick. I have no idea. I don't know what a good CEO even means. Like, the way these things work and the way, tasks and stuff get delegated, that, he probably, these CEOs must do so little actual work, other than just like catering to the board and stuff like that, I have to imagine. But that would definitely be an interesting move. I'm way more interested in what it would mean for EA, because Andrew Wilson was the one that for many years was pushing live service games and multiplayer games, and getting away from the classic, especially like BioWare, the the third person action adventure Western RPG, very little DLC, if DLC at all, like not focusing on microtransactions and all that, where he was real big on doing that stuff. But then in more recent years has switched over and been like, yeah, these single player, non DLC, non microtransaction games, they do have a place on our publisher. And not only that, they're probably one of the bigger money makers. Obviously games like Apex and stuff have probably been very lucrative for them over the last 5-6 years, or however long it's been out. I can't even remember. But you need a balance, right? Like, you need a mix. You can't just fully depend on live service multiplayer games. We've seen what's happened to PlayStation when they at least, lean that direction for a little bit, and it didn't work. It went really bad for them. So yeah, so I'm really curious to what happens with this. If Andrew Wilson leaves there, you kind of just have to wait and see who replaces him. I'm actually dealing with this same situation at my work, where at my work, the CEO who's leaving in the next few months, has been a steady hand. He's been there, even longer than me. I've been working at my job over a decade, and he's been there twice as long, and so we're all kind of waiting on, eggshells to see who replaces them. And I have to imagine it would be something similar over at EA if Andrew Wilson bounced. It's one of those things that, like, it's like the devil, right? So like, even if you don't like Andrew Wilson, and there's plenty of reasons not to, you could at least kind of predict what he was going to do, what EA's direction is. If they hire someone to replace him, if there's going to be a new person in that job, who knows? It's going to be a wild card. So we'll have to wait and see. Itsuno, the former, I believe, director or creator of Dragon's Dogma 2 and some other Capcom games, has left Capcom to go to a Tencent studio called Lightspeed Japan Studio. My only real comment on this is, like, maybe now that he's gone, the next Dragon Age will actually be a good game, instead of Dragon's Dogma 2 was weird to me this year, because the first like 4 or 5 hours, it was like, I was like, man, this might end up being my game of the year. And then by hour 35 or 40, I think it might be the game I dislike, the worst game of the year, Dragon's Dogma 2. A game that very well may end up making at least Jeff Keighley's top 5 or whatever it is for game of the year. It's going to be a frustrating year for that, but we'll get there in a moment. Actually, let's talk about now. Game of the year. Jeff Keighley is starting to ramp up his advertisements for the Game Awards. As you know, he does his big theater presentation, and does or doesn't give people who win time to actually talk about their game. We'll have to wait and see how that plays out this year. But he, I'm really curious. I will say this year, I'm still kind of deciding between Dragon Age and Hellblade 2 as my game of the year, personally. And I'm really struggling. I'm telling you, that Pokemon card game is really sneaking its way into my brain, even though I don't think it's going to usurp either of those. I think it's really interesting how I'm looking forward to the Game Awards, because I'm not invested. I don't think the two games I'm even deliberating between will even get maybe nominated. I would really love to see Dragon Age get nominated, at least for some categories, even if it doesn't win. But yeah, I don't know. We'll have to wait and see. Zenimax studio QA workers are striking after changes to remote work policies and the changes regarding outsourcing their jobs. You know, I do think it's strange, or it's interesting more than strange, that, you know, these strikes in the game industry are almost always QA workers. And so at least in my brain, it makes me think like, man, that must be a rough job. Like that must be tough, because if you're making like a decent wage and you're doing play testing, you're probably mostly satisfied with your job, right? At least in some capacity. So, we'll see what comes of that. The Saudi Arabia Public Investment Fund is actually pulling stake from Nintendo from 7.5% to 6.3. Kind of interesting. I don't know if there's some kind of remaking of some financial, storage locations and stuff with the upcoming inauguration of a new president in the United States, a president who, at least I would argue, is incredibly unfit and dangerous to the world. But what do I know? I'm just a guy talking to a couple people about video games. And then the final thing here is the Pokemon TCG Pocket. We'll be getting new booster packs towards the end of 2024, as well as, I believe, early 2025 card trading. I love this game. I love this game in a way that's like scary. I've spent a little bit of money on it. It's been like $20. But man, I just want to spend 1,000. I just want to have it. I want to catch them all. So, this is the first mobile game I've played more than 10 minutes or so. So if you're not a mobile game person, but you like Pokemon and you want something to be able to waste some time on, Pokemon TCG Pocket is pretty cool. Just hide your wallet. That's my advice. And then wrapping this thing up with some content update. I'm still going to keep posting over on Twitter. Not engaging as much over there as I used to, but still posting a decent amount. Threads is the one I actually prefer the most, but I have been doing more on Blue Sky lately as I've been seeing more engagement there. Hit me up on any of them. You can leave comments, and soon you'll be able to make posts in the community tab on YouTube. You can hit up my Discord and come in there and chat. Just don't be weird. We've had like 10 people join, fairly recently, and I've had to boot them all because they were either bots or being weirdos. I have no idea. But jump in there, prove to us that you're not a weirdo, and you can hang out. We can talk about games and sports and, basically everything else. But yeah, with the social media platforms, man, it's, I don't know. I don't know what's going on there. Threads and Blue Sky are kind of facing off, and that could be a good thing as they improve each other. Twitter's over there just doing its thing, being the whim of a billionaire and being used, at least in some capacity, to, get some things that billionaire probably wanted. Just weird times, strange times with all of that stuff. But, be sure to find me if you want updates, or just subscribe to the podcast. That's another way to get everything I, for the most part, am going to talk about. And then the final thing is with YouTube specifically. I've probably had to hide the users of at least 2/3 of the comments on my Dragon Age and Mass Effect videos lately. I get it. You don't like the woke mind virus or whatever idiotic stuff you've come up with. If you don't have anything nice to say or constructive to say, I suggest just not saying it. If you do, I do appreciate you making my muted user or my hidden user trap very, very full of people. And at this point, I'll probably never let them go, just to throw it out there. But yeah, so keep it civil in the comments. I don't mind if you disagree with me. I don't mind if we have completely different takes on things. But if you are gonna, start saying stupid stuff, at least stupid in my opinion, I highly, highly, highly suggest not doing that. I love interacting with people, even if they disagree with me. Actually, especially if they disagree with me, and many times, because I think it's good to expand your mind to get other people's perspectives. But if the reason that you hate a thing is because someone around you told you to, or because you've done your quote unquote research, and you decide to spread that stuff in my comments, you're going to be hidden. You will not be seen, is what I would say. And that is where I'm going to wrap up this show. If you have your own topics, questions, or feedback, be sure to let me know in my Discord, in the YouTube comments, or hit me up on social media at Bondiesel or at the Baunfire. That is all I have for this episode of the Baunfire Gaming Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this whole episode. And until next time.